Well, thanks, Keith. The other day I had a most unusual experience. Someone told an economist joke that I hadn't heard before. It actually takes a while before people get it, but I'll tell you anyway. What's the difference between a psychiatrist and an economist? Psychiatrists ruin people's lives one at a time. And I'll tell you one more before we get down. What do you get when you cross an economist with a member of the mafia? An offer you can't understand. Well, I hope that the economics I talk about tonight you will be able to understand. That's really a question of how hard I've tried. And I also hope that we'll be able to discuss a bit of economics without actually ruining anyone's life. I was pleased to attend the first of these Walter Westman Lectures, as we heard in 2008, given by my friend Steve Hadfield-Dodds, and I'm honoured to deliver this year's lecture. I want to talk about economic growth, a topic of concern to many people who think deeply about science, humanity and the environment, and especially about whether it will be feasible for us to move to a steady state economy. Virtually all our business people, economists and politicians believe it to be not just possible but desirable for the economy to continue growing forever, and the faster the better. They regard the achievement of growth as one of the most important objectives of government, and they have no doubt that this accords with the wishes of almost everyone in the electorate. Why do they regard economic growth as such a good thing? Because when the economy's generation of income and its production of goods and services, which is the same thing and is conventionally measured by the growth in real gross domestic product, when income grows faster than the population is growing, income per person is rising, meaning that on average, our material standard of living is rising. Doesn't that sound good to you? But the advocates of growth believe it brings with it many other advantages. They argue that the richer we get, the more easily we can afford to spend money fixing the environment. They argue that rising real incomes should also directly benefit the poor, and as well, that when incomes are rising, it's easier to get agreement to redistribute income in favour of the poor. They further argue that growth in the economy is necessary to create the additional jobs needed to provide employment for a growing population of working age. So why do an increasing minority of people oppose continuing economic growth? Because of their belief that unending economic growth is ecologically unsustainable and indeed physically impossible. They see the global economy as a subsystem of the global ecosystem, which is of fixed size. If the ecosystem can't grow, then there must be a limit to the extent to which the economy can grow within it. They look at all the damage economic activity has done and is doing to the natural environment, the damage to soil, forests, waterways, fish stocks. We heard a story today about concern about the water table in coastal areas going down and then becoming too salty. It's We hear concerns of that nature all the time. And when we do, these people, the people who worry about growth, conclude that we must be close to the limits to growth. To press up to those limits or even exceed them must surely damage the natural environment to such an extent that huge, possibly irreparable damage is done to the economy, not just the environment. I mean, that's really what the concern about climate change is about. It's not so much that we worry about the climate as that we worry about what the climate will do to us in our economy. That's the most fundamental, pressing reason for wanting to call a halt to growth. But there's a supporting reason from the science of happiness. Psychologists and a few economists are studying what they prefer to call subjective well-being, and they've concluded that once people's incomes reach a certain fairly modest level, further increases do little or nothing to raise the aggregate happiness of the people in a country. This is because we so quickly adapt to any change in our material circumstances, with improvements still soon being taken for granted as we aspire to something bigger and better. But it's also because, as studies show, what makes everyone but the poor happier as individuals is not an increase in our income along with everybody else's, but an increase in our income relative to everybody else's. It's this that would feed our desire to feel superior to others and also permit us to demonstrate that superiority to the world by means of our superior possessions. The trouble with such aspirations, however, is that they involve a zero-sum game. I can advance my position in the pecking order only at the expense of the positions of all the people that I pass. Such status competition, such consumption competitions, are socially wasteful. They use up a host of scarce economic resources without any net addition to total happiness. For the managers of the economy, this creates two problems that I see but they don't get. First one is, all they can ever do is raise incomes overall. There's nothing they can do to raise the relative incomes of everybody. So their growth-favouring policies do little or nothing to increase the community's subjective well-being, which must surely be the justification for their efforts. Second problem for the economic managers is that it means that for an affluent economy such as ours, most of the annual increase in our real incomes that the economic managers have laboured to produce is dissipated on the socially wasteful purchase of positional goods. Goods and services whose purpose is to demonstrate to others our superior position in the social pecking order. Let's say you need a car. If you can buy a car that takes you from A to B perfectly efficiently, perfectly safely for say $20,000, mine actually cost less than that. But you prefer to buy a BMW for $100,000, that means the first $20,000 you spent was on the cost of the car, and the next $80,000 you spent was on a positional good. something that advertised to your friends, to your neighbours, how well you were doing, or at least demonstrated that you were doing no worse than all the people in your street. That's a positional good. For me, this is a powerful reason for not being too dismayed by the ecologists' insistence that we can no longer afford economic growth. If so, we won't be giving up all that much. This brings me directly to my topic. Is a steady state economy and economy that doesn't grow feasible? First, I'll examine the reasons people argue it isn't feasible, then I'll examine what we need to do to make it feasible. The growth imperative is so deeply ingrained in our thinking, so much an assumption underlying so much of what we say, even what I say, that many people imagine the economy to be like a bicycle. If you stop going forward, you lose your balance and you fall off. Fortunately, that analogy isn't apt. Though many people would have to adjust their thinking in a steady state economy, it wouldn't collapse just because it wasn't growing. What would cause deep problems, however, is if the economy was steadily shrinking, particularly if prices were falling. That's a quite different case. There's obviously truth to the argument that when incomes are growing, it's easier to afford to repair the environment. But that argument becomes dubious when we reach the point where the growth itself is adding to the environmental damage. We have to destroy the environment to afford to save it. It's hard to imagine how the environment could end up ahead on a deal like that. There's more truth to the argument that when incomes are growing, it's easier to give the poor a better deal, including by redistributing income from the better off to the less well off. It's factually correct in Australia, though not in America, that real growth in national income over the years has led to real growth in the incomes of households at the bottom of the distribution. The poor are not getting poorer, they are getting wealthier. So real incomes have been growing at the bottom, at the middle and at the top. Now that's not true in America, but it is true in Australia and has long been true. What's also true, however, is that incomes at the very top have been growing much faster than all other incomes. I think the advocates of a steady state economy have to accept that yes, the absence of growth would increase political resistance to greater redistribution in favour of those at the bottom. But just because growth makes greater redistribution easier doesn't necessarily mean that redistribution happens. It hasn't happened sufficiently to prevent the gap between the rich and poor widening significantly over the past 30 years or so, notwithstanding all the growth we've enjoyed. So it's an argument that's got a fair bit of power in theory, but in practice we haven't been doing anything with it, in which case we wouldn't be losing all that much compared to what we've had. The strongest anti-steady state argument is that we need economic growth to provide employment for our growing population of workforce age. It's pretty much the only argument I get from the ecologically aware economists that I talk to. But I don't think it's insurmountable. The first reservation is that were it not for immigration, our working age population wouldn't be growing, as is also the case for most of the advanced economies, and will soon be the case for China, thanks to the one-child policy. We could adjust our net migration to keep the working age population steady. That wouldn't be terribly hard. The second reservation I have is that even if our working age population was growing, we could respond to the problem by job sharing. Here, I'm not only referring to the idea of 2 or more part-time workers sharing one full-time job, but to the more fundamental solution that rather continuing to take the continuing improvement in the productivity of labour in the form of ever higher real wages, we could do what the futurists of the 1960s and 1970s expected we'd do, and take it in the form of shorter working hours. You can do that. If the productivity of labour is going, you can work for shorter hours for the same money without any economic cost. It's a choice that we make as a community as to whether we want our growing affluence to be reflected in higher incomes or shorter hours. Before I turn to the more positive question of how we go about achieving a steady state economy, I should clarify an issue I probably should have raised much earlier. In all that follows, I'll be leaning heavily on the leading thinker in the area of steady state economics, Professor Herman Daly of the University of Maryland. There's enormous terminological confusion between scientists and economists on what exactly they mean by the word growth. Scientists take it to mean something very different from what economists do, which means that much of what little debate passes between the scientists and the economists, I really believe that the inclination of academics is to stay in their corners and tell each other how hopeless the other lot are without ever really making great effort to get together and box it out and to come to some kind of mutual understanding, at least of the exact points on which they disagree. I guess what I'm saying here is that I'm sure the ground of disagreement between them would be greatly reduced if only this terminological confusion could be ended. What ecologists want is an end to growth in the throughput of natural resources. That's what they want. If you think of the economy as a machine, we put inputs in one end of the machine and take outputs out the other end of the machine. To an ecologist, the inputs of concern to them are natural resources and ecosystem services, the things that the environment does for us free of charge for the most part. The outputs of concern to the ecologists are an equivalent amount of waste in the form of landfill, sewage, and all the many types of pollution, including greenhouse gases. In conformity with the laws of thermodynamics, the ecologists worry as much about the emissions of waste and the ecosystem's ability to absorb that waste as they do about the using up of natural resources. That's why what they seek is an end to growth in the throughput of such resources. I think many of them imagine this would be achieved if GDP ceased to grow. But the economists conceptualise things very differently. To them, the inputs to the economic machine aren't just natural resources, but also the other economic resources labour and capital. By capital, I mean physical capital in the form of machines and structures and infrastructure. The input from the ecosystem services is ignored by the economists, mainly because, as I say, nature provides that free of charge. If it's free of charge, it's of no interest to us. To the economist's eyes, the output from the economic machine isn't waste. It gets ignored because there's usually no cost. Well, the costs of dealing with the sewage get counted. But really, if it's just bad smells or carbon dioxide being emitted, that all gets ignored because there's no cost, no obvious cost associated with that. Okay, so the outputs that the only thing economists are interested in is the outputs of goods and services. Since those of us who work earn our income from our contribution to the output of goods and services, real GDP also measures the growth in real income. So, what is it that causes GDP, output of goods and services, to grow? Two things. First, any increase in the throughput of economic resources, natural resources, but also labour and capital. But second, and this is the bit that goes straight over the heads of most ecologists, any increase in the efficiency of the economic machine in turning inputs into outputs. You see, the first law of thermodynamics says that what goes in is of exactly the same quantity as what comes out. It's just had its form changed from resources to waste. But when the economists look at the machine, they see it as a quite magical thing where you put in a certain quantity of resources, and as each year passes, you get out a higher quantity of goods and services than you did last year. Now, that might sound magical, but in fact, it's been happening since the Industrial Revolution. Economists call that increase in output relative to input productivity, which they define as output per unit of input. The productivity of the economic machine increases almost continuously each year and has done since the start of the Industrial Revolution. What causes multi-factor productivity, as economists call it, to improve is the continuing pursuit of economies of scale, the increasing specialisation of labour, the rising knowledge and skill of the workforce, and technological advance, the invention of better machines and better ways of doing things. That is where the magic of capitalism comes from all of those things. You can read about most of them in Adam Smith. Now get this, over the long term, productivity improvement accounts for the lion's share of our rising real income per person, and thus our rising material standard of living. It comes from increasing productivity. And that's the reason why you've seen me, if you follow my columns, writing incessantly in the past 6 months about productivity and how we've got these figures that seem to be saying productivity has stopped going up and started going down. Now, it turns out that that's quite misleading But the point is that from a capitalist point of view, from a conventional point of view, if that's true, it is a big deal. The point is that when economists hear people say they want an end to growth, they assume that means they want an end to productivity improvement. They find this prospect appalling, and they wonder how anyone in their right mind could want to stop the magic. But this is not what ecologists want. All they want to stop is growth in the throughput of natural resources, which isn't something most economists would relish, but isn't nearly as frightening as stopping productivity growth. And this means GDP could still increase, provided that increase came from improved productivity, not increased use of natural resources. And that's the point. In a steady state economy, GDP does not have to stop growing. Clearing up this misunderstanding allows us to envisage more clearly what a steady state economy would look like. It would be an economy that didn't get bigger in its impact on the environment, that was ecologically sustainable, but it did get better in terms of the quality of our lives. It would be an economy that didn't grow, but it wouldn't be an economy that was stagnant, that never changed. It wouldn't be an economy where people had to stop striving to build a better mousetrap, striving to write a symphony, striving to find the cure for cancer. The steady state economy is not anti-striving. Many economists instinctively fear a steady state economy would stifle the incentive to innovate. I think in my day I've had the Secretary of the Treasury saying, if we had that, Ross, we'd get no more medical advance. Well, I don't think that's true. I don't think that fear is justified, and indeed you can argue that with the quantitative route to improvement blocked off, the qualitative route, which is actually the productivity bit, would gain more attention. Herman Daly's way of making the distinction is to say economic growth, pushing more resources through a physically larger economy, is bad, but economic development, squeezing more welfare from the same throughput of resources, is fine. This is a very important distinction, very important in reducing the perceived poles apart of scientists and ecologists on the one side and conventional economists on the other. But how would we go about reorganising the economy so that we no longer increase the throughput of natural resources? Well, it wouldn't be easy, but nor would it be terrifically hard. It actually represents nothing more than a design problem, one the economics profession is well equipped to solve, should we decide to give it that task. One of the things I like to say is in a steady state economy, all the economists would keep their jobs because we'd have to think we'd have to get them to figure out how we could do it. The kind of ethic of economics is that economists advise the community on how to get the biggest bang for their buck. That's why economists are so obsessed by productivity and efficiency. Efficiency and productivity are very similar concepts. And in theory, economist is just like any other professional who provides advice to clients. You tell me what your problem is, what you want to achieve, I tell you how to achieve it. What we specialise in is telling you how to get a quart out of a pint pot. I think I've got those dimensions right. What we often see, of course, is economists, some economists anyway, going much further than that. Instead of saying, you the community, tell me what your problem is and I'll help you solve it, I'll propose the best available solutions. They want to tell us what we should be doing, what our problem is and what the answer to it should be. Often that involves cannibalising some of our objectives. Because you see, if you're prepared to give up living a pleasant life, I can assure you, I can give you rock solid advice about how to get richer. It always works. And economists step over the line when they start saying, you want to give up all these non-economic objectives that you've got, because if only you would turn them from ends into means, I could make you much richer. Now, that's all pretty crazy. That's what economists too often fall into the trap of doing. And that's where what we're getting is not their professional expertise, but their value judgments and their ideology. Okay, so it's just a design problem which, once the community made up its mind, the economics profession had no choice but to put their minds to the question of how we could bring this about at minimum cost. At minimum cost to our material standard of living, which is the problem that they specialise in. Now, we still have a capitalist market economy where market forces continue to determine economic outcomes and to drive the push for greater efficiency and resource use within the framework set by the government. And you know, don't believe all this stuff about free markets. There are no free markets. What there are is markets that work within a framework set by the government. It's probably true that markets are in fact an invention of government. It's a terribly ideologically incorrect thing to say, but I think historically it's probably true. So what we have with markets is no free markets. What we have is some markets that are more heavily regulated by the government than others. That's, and in fact we're arguing, all the sensible argument is about where you draw the line between intervention and free play of market forces. What I'm saying here is that what I'm about to describe, which comes from Herman Daly, would still be a capitalist market economy where market forces were the dominant influence determining economic outcomes and where they would continue to drive the push for greater efficiency and resource use, and that all that would happen within the framework set by the government. And the one change would be, the big difference, would be the government adding a new constraint to the operation of market forces, which is a limit on the consumption of natural resources. Because that's all the environmentalists care about. That's their only problem. Now, how would we achieve that limit? By using the same economic instrument we've already begun using to limit the burning of fossil fuels, a system of tradable permits. You impose a cap on the total quantity of certain class of natural resources permitted to be consumed in a year. You auction to producers permits to use the resource up to the cap that you've set. The more efficient firms are at doing what they want to do while using fewer natural resources to do it, the less they have to spend on permits, thus harnessing market forces to help reduce the use of those resources. Firms that discover they have more permits than they need are able to trade them for money with firms that discover they need more permits than they have. That's the tradable bit. By such means, the burden of limiting resource use to the cap is transferred to those firms able to reduce their resource use most cheaply, thereby limiting the loss of income to the community involved in achieving the limit on resource use. As firms became more efficient at reducing their natural resource use, including by the invention of new technological solutions to the problem, and part of the magic that the economists are hoping to unleash is the magic of someone inventing a way to do things much better than we used to be able to do them. And that happens all the time, as you know from comparing the car you drive today with the car you drove 20 or 30 years ago. As firms become more efficient at reducing their natural resource use, it will be possible, if desired, to lower the cap and hence the quantity of resources used at no increased cost to the community because of the increased efficiency in minimising the waste of natural resources. And in fact, we have an enormous amount of waste of natural resources at the moment for reasons that I'll come to in a minute. The purpose of such a cap and trade scheme would be, of course, to raise the price of natural resources and the prices of goods with a high natural resource component, to raise that price relative to the prices of all other goods and services. In line with the most orthodox economics, and this stuff I'm giving you, the objective is not orthodox, but the methodology is completely orthodox. In line with the most orthodox economics, it's this change in relative prices which would motivate producers and consumers to reduce their resource use and do so with minimum loss of economic efficiency. Economists believe changes in relative prices are very effective in bringing about changes in the behaviour of producers and consumers. Now that's something you might want to debate with me. I think there are some economists who think that it's more magical than it is, but there are plenty of non-economists who don't really understand how powerful prices are in affecting behaviour. This process would, of course, lead to a once-off increase in the general level of consumer prices, which might be quite a significant increase. Many of you would be concerned about the effect of that on the cost of living, particularly for pensioners and other low-income earners. But as with our present carbon tax, once the cap and trade scheme had brought about the desired change in relative prices, the proceeds from the sale of permits, analogous to the proceeds from our carbon tax, are available for use to reduce the rates of other taxes, the obvious one being income tax, and increase the rates of pensions and benefits, such as the family allowance, thereby compensating households for the increase in their cost of living. This is the part of the carbon price that people have so much trouble understanding, and that's because they don't understand conventional economists' obsession with changing relative prices in the right direction. once the economists have changed their relative prices, they'll give you back all the money. They are not actually trying to force you to change your behaviour by leaving you poorer. So they'll give it back to you. They use the tax to raise the price of the things that they are trying to get you to economise in the use of, then they'll give you back the money, confident that very little of the money they give you back will be used to increase your consumption of the things that they're trying to discourage you from consuming. So I don't see a reason to be concerned about the effect of the move on the welfare of low-income earners. They can be looked after without any great bother, as they have been with the price on carbon. The people at the low end have had as close as the government can do it to full compensation, and some people will have overcompensation, unless the government's calculations are wildly astray or are astray. The people who haven't been compensated are basically people on incomes over 80,000 each as individuals. There's no compensation for me. In other words, it is true that the government has used the carbon tax to redistribute income from the rich to the poor. Yes, they have. Such a rejig of the tax system would be a classic example of what environmental economists mean when they call for the burden of tax collection to be shifted from taxing goods, such as labour and capital, good things that means, to taxing bads, such as greenhouse gas emissions and the consumption of natural resources. You raise the same amount of total taxation revenue, but in the process you discourage activities you want to discourage rather than activities you don't want to discourage. Raising the prices of natural resources relative to the prices of other resources, labelled capital, could be expected to have various desirable side effects. First, it would increase the economic incentive for people to recycle natural resources and repair rather than replace appliances with a high materials component, which of course is all appliances. Because you've changed the relative prices, you've increased the incentive for people not to just throw away something that stops working. And you've increased the economic incentive to recycle. There is actually a big problem with all the recycling that goes on in Australia, and that is that people are much more enthusiastic about handing over their stuff that they imagine can be recycled than are the people at the other end who are looking only to recycle things they can make a buck out of. The local council knows that we want to recycle, so one of the great understated stories is that the commercial world isn't terribly interested in this stuff. They would be more interested if the relative prices were different. The second effect of raising the prices of natural resources relative to the prices of other resources, labour and capital, second effect is that changing the relative prices could be expected to change the focus of the private sector's continuing search for greater efficiency, economising if you like, in the use of economic resources and hence improved productivity. For all the time since the Industrial Revolution, most of the economising effort including most technological advance, has been quite logically directed towards economising in the use of the most expensive resource, labour. But if we were to make natural resources more expensive than labour, particularly if the scheme involved a fall in the main tax on labour, which is income tax, thereby lowering the effective cost of labour, this should mean a lot more entrepreneurial effort would be directed towards reducing the economy's despoiling of the natural environment. They'd be doing it because it was the new way to make a buck. Now, there are many more implications of the steady-state economy that I could explore, but I think that's enough for us to be going on with. Is a steady-state economy feasible? Yes, it is. Thank you.
Thanks for that encouraging and inspirational lecture. We've got a few minutes for questions to Ross. I was intrigued by your comment, as an economist, that price signals will change behaviour. If that's the case, why do people still smoke? We keep on increasing the price, and yet people won't listen to the price signals.
Well, as a certain gentleman at Sydney University would be very, very happy to explain to you, Simon.
Oh, Simon.
Simon
Chapman.
Yes.
Yeah.
The increasing in the tax on cigarettes has been hugely effective in discouraging young people from taking up smoking. It's much less effective in discouraging someone who's already addicted, or encouraging someone who's already addicted to give it up. But even there, it would help.
Yeah.
The problem is with smoking is addiction in my view.
Yes, sir. I'd like to stand and throw your voice at me so I can... Oh, you're going to get a microphone. Right.
Hello?
Yep.
Yep. Your average income level beyond which there's little correlation with subjective well-being is probably achieved by the majority of people in the developed world, but the majority of people in the undeveloped world would be well below that level of income. So if we want to penalise or hold back those people, is that going to be an outcome of what you are promoting?
No, but one of the ways I save space is not addressing that dichotomy in my speech. Forgive me for saying so, but it's dealt with much more thoroughly in my book, A Happy Economist. That does create problems because I mean, there is, I see absolutely no moral justification for the rich countries to say to the poor countries, terribly sorry, but we've already stuffed the thing. You can't get any richer, and we're not going to help you get any richer. I don't think that, and what's more, take it from me, he wouldn't enjoy being richer. We've got all these studies to show that. Now, A, I don't think that's moral for us to say that to poor people, and B, they would take absolutely no notice. That is one of the big, when you look at this thing on a global level, which you really have to, that is one of the big problems. The two problems are the two reasons that cause a difficulty to the natural environment are the number of people in the world, the growing number of people in the world, and their growing average standard of living. I think we need to do a deal with the poor countries which say, if you try harder to stop your populations growing, we, who don't actually have a population problem in the West, take away immigration from the poor countries, and the rich countries' population is not growing. But if you would do more on trying to limit the growth in your population, we will try and leave you more room to allow a higher material standard of living, something a bit closer to us. That's a difficult issue, and it's a very key, you put your finger on a key issue. What works for a rich country like Australia, and I limited myself to talking about the rich country solution, is not something you can go to China and get them to implement.
Steve.
Oh, Ross, we have another issue here in Australia, of course, and it's the Western world's issue, where over the last 30 years, governments kind of pulled out of the job of looking after people in retirement, and we've required people to fund their own retirements, and we've done that without a lot of education to the public about shareholder value and the whole role that shareholder value plays in the development of corporations in our economy. One of the issues that I see as a big problem is the fact that shareholder value is still perceived as almost a god by people even that run corporations. How are we going to deal with that as an educational issue to change people's focus on that? And also, what are we going to do with all that money? Is there a way that we can actually use some of these funds in a more productive way?
Well, yes. First thing is, I don't quite see that our governments have drawn back from helping people fund their retirements. I don't see that at all, really. The age pension is still there, and we're pumping huge subsidies into the superannuation system. You can say it's all unfair, but you can't say that the government has withdrawn. On shareholder value, I don't quite know how you educate people, but I think they certainly need to be educated, and one of the things that they need to be educated on is that when CEOs bang on about shareholder value, what they really mean is my share options.